it feels like it's named after gum, and that's funny. The idea that a gum company could afford to pay for naming rights on a park is so good.
Don't worry, folks. We're going to talk about the biggest trade in NBA history, even on this baseball podcast. But we must begin with the opener.
Movement on the free agent market. Jack Flaherty, the best starting pitcher still available, agreed to a deal late on Sunday evening. 2 years, $35 million with the Detroit Tigers, the team that he was on at the first chunk of last season before he was dealt to the Dodgers at the deadline and won the World Series with them. He was on the Tigers, remember? Tigers traded Jack Flaherty away, and everyone was like, oh, well, I guess they're not trying to make the playoffs. Little did we know. But Jack Flaherty, who at one point was one of the most exciting young hurlers in baseball for the St. Louis Cardinals, getting Cy Young votes earlier on in his career, kind of fell off after chucking a mountain's worth of innings during the Panorama, comes back after that shortened season. It just doesn't look the same. But something of a resurgence last year with the Detroit Tigers and Los Angeles Dodgers. Not quite the payday he and his agents were looking for, but he does get $25 million in the first year of this deal with an opt-out after year one. Jordan Shusterman, what do you make of the Jack Flaherty news?
Well, let's rewind a year, right? I mean, when he got healthy enough to make 27 starts in 2023 after being very injured and struggling the 3 years prior after his breakout 2019, it was like, okay, obviously this is going to be a one-year deal situation where he needs to go reestablish his ability. Maybe he had started to reestablish his durability, but especially that second half with Baltimore was a disaster, right?
Right.
I mean, I don't got to tell you. You're holding up a pillow. I don't know what you're trying to signify right now. What are you showing me right now? It was a pillow contract. It was a pillow contract. Thank you, Jake. Sorry. Jake and I, we've been working together a long time. Normally I could pick up what he's trying to do, but that took me a couple extra seconds. Yes, Jack Flaherty took a 1 year, $14 million pillow contract. Oh, soft landing with the Detroit Tigers. And with that first half, it was like, oh my gosh, here we go. This is his age 28 season. This looks almost as good as the Jack Flaherty we saw in 2019. It was certainly pretty close to that. And, those first couple months, like, great. Like, I don't know what's going to happen down the stretch. I don't know if he's going to stay healthy. I don't know if he's going to get traded, but like, this is going well. And it's so interesting to me that what seems to have maybe hurt him in this market is everything that happened after the trade, which is that he took some small steps back with the command, with the strikeouts. The ERA was still okay, but certainly not as good with the Dodgers. And then in October, he obviously was pitching on national TV multiple times, and he had one unbelievable start against the Mets. And other than that, it wasn't awesome. And because when you combine that with sort of the reporting involving the deadline where the Yankees were interested in acquiring him, but they kind of backed out due to medical concerns, it went into the offseason where even though he didn't have a qualifying offer attached, there was still like, all right, like how much do teams really want to pay Jack Flaherty? And now we kind of have an answer, which is a very interesting answer.
So we have a very compelling situation here, because if I said to you, hey, there's a free agent pitcher, he just turned 28, and in his age 28 season, he threw 162 innings and had a 3.17 ERA, and struck out almost 11 batters per nine. Like, that guy's usually going to get pretty paid. There are thousands of comps, but a decent one in my mind would be Kevin Gausman, who came up with a lot of buzz, decent to good in the early stretches of his career, hits a lull, bounces back right before free agency. I believe Gausman got 5.110, and this felt like a pretty robust starting pitching market. And for Flaherty to only get a 2-year deal with an opt-out after the first one, something's not right here. Something doesn't compute. The pieces don't add up to the outcome. And so what does that tell you, right? It kind of tells you that the medical's probably horrifying. Now, we don't know that. That's purely speculation. It's either that or people just simply aren't buying the rebound that he had a year ago. Now, look, $25 million is a nice chunk of change. That's good work, if you can get it. But it is definitely below expectations for Flaherty. Now, it's also a little helpful to understand like why he was so much better last season. Like what propelled this resurgence. The velo ticked up a little bit across the board. It was still below average on the fastball. But the biggest difference was him attacking the strike zone more often and hitting his spots on the edges and the shadow of the strike zone, putting pitches where he wanted them to be. Particularly his slider, which is a really good pitch that he is elite command over when he's purring. So this tells me that teams still have some skepticism about his ability to locate those pitches consistently. Where do you kind of fall on this? Now, obviously, you have not seen the medicals. You are not a doctor yet. I mean, you could, who knows?
No, not happening. So I'm just going to, I know maybe, not with that attitude, Jordan, you could be a doctor. No, I'm not going to be a doctor.
We're all pre-med if you think about it.
Right. But I can't comment on the, I mean, I can look at his track record of health and say, all right, well, that's better or worse than some other guys that are getting paid. And remember, the Tigers just gave Alex Cobb $15 million a couple months ago. So they clearly have some level of risk tolerance. But as we just focus on Flaherty, right, he checked a lot of boxes of someone that you could see getting the rare 4 or even 5-year deal for a starting pitcher, which we essentially have not seen at all this winter outside of Corbin Burnes and, the big three, right? The Snell, Burnes, Fried group. Other than that, I don't think any other starting pitcher has received more than 3 years. But the fact that Flaherty ends up with the same contract as with front-loaded, with the opt-out, but as Frankie Montas, like that's not what I expected. So if we focus on the profile, Gausman, I think, does have some parallels, but what Gausman had was the one freak pitch, right? His splitter kind of carried him and has continued to carry him in a lot of ways. And you could apply that to a few other pitchers and free agents. Like, okay, what is carrying their profile? I think what's interesting to me about Flaherty, and this has kind of always been true, he's a fastball and 2 different breaking ball guys. He's never been a changeup. That's not really been his pitch, at least not recently. And so his command and ability to execute both the curveball and the slider, when he does not have above average velocity, that clearly has fluctuated his level of performance. Now, this past year, both the curveball and slider were excellent. And I think the slider has obviously been a pitch that has been successful for him for a very long time. So there's reasons to believe that could still be true. But there's almost less wiggle room when you don't have that fastball velocity. And maybe that's part of why teams are not buying it. Now, at the same time, you could apply this to some of the starting pitchers. It's 2025. I mean, I'm sure there are also pitchers or teams that were looking at Jack Flaherty to be like, oh, maybe we can give him a sinker. Oh, maybe we can finally teach him a changeup. Why I find this fit so interesting is clearly he was comfortable in Detroit. Whatever he was doing in Detroit last year was working. And so they know him. They had him, and he clearly loved it there. Skubal loved having him in that rotation. Like, he spoke glowingly of that. He's said, like, I would love to go back to Detroit. And now they found a compromise here, which is a pretty interesting compromise where you are front loading the deal. I mean, $25 million for 1 year for any pitcher is pretty significant. But there's clearly a much lower risk for I think still more so for the team than for the player. I mean, yes, there's some flexibility for Flaherty here, but for the Tigers, I mean, if I imagine at the start of the offseason, they were like, yeah, we love Jack Flaherty, we'd love to have him back, but he's going to get $100 million. Well, it got to the point where that wasn't going to happen, and they're like, great, let's do it. We still need rotation help.
I love that Flaherty half announced this himself by tweeting out a GIF of Tarek Skubal, which is hilarious. Then a picture of Tupac in a Red Wings jersey. Okay. And then I think that is Isaiah Thomas and Dennis Rodman on the Pistons.
And then a picture of him on the Tigers. This was all like 2 minutes before Jeff Passan hit it with the all caps breaking. Now, this didn't totally shock me because, like, if you were like, who's going to announce their signing on Twitter, like, he would have been one of my first picks. I mean, Jack's been tweeting through it all winter.
All
winter. He's been picking fights with Petriello. He's been commenting on the Dodgers. Jack Flaherty's very online, for better or for worse. So this was, and he's recently been publicly open about being like, yeah, I'd love to go back to Detroit. He said that like last week, I think, on Foul Territory. And so, clearly the market got to the point where they were comfortable with it. And now, after we talked about Tommy Kahnle last week, like the Tigers offseason still maybe unfinished, right? Bregman's still out there, but it's rounding more into like, okay, they seemingly got better.
I'm disappointed in his choice of pictures. I would have preferred a picture of the Detroit sign, or maybe the giant slide. Or a picture of
more GMAC. Yeah, I don't know.
Bobby Higginson.
Jack Flaherty has to know about GMAC Cash. There's no way. There's no chance he's not on the GMAC Cash train.
GMAC Cash,
maybe we'll see that collab at some point.
The official Detroit hip hop artist of the podcast. All right, from one young pitcher getting paid to one old pitcher getting paid, Max Scherzer and his heterochromidia, one blue eye, one brown eye, heading up north to Canada for 1 year and $15.5 million. Now, the funniest part about this deal is that Justin Verlander, another old future Hall of Famer, got 1 year, $15 million from the Giants. And so Scherzer gets 1 year, $15.5 million. Maybe that's what tariffs are. Who can say? Let's very quickly boot up the Scobo, the Scott Boras scoreboard, as Max Scherzer is represented by the game's most notorious agent. This is a win, an enormous win, just because of the pettiness of getting $15.5 million, $500,000 more than Justin Verlander. The idea of a $500,000 bit shtick is hilarious because that's so much money, right? Like on its own.
Yeah, right. It's obviously
it's like
it's a nice little.
It's like Venmoing your friend 3 cents, except they're richer than us. But that's a nice bit of money for a guy who threw 43 innings last year, right? Like Max Scherzer is Max Scherzer and will be in Cooperstown and is one of the best pitchers of his generation. He is also going to throw this year at age 40. He threw 43 innings last year. He threw 45 the year before that. He threw 152 in 2020, or excuse me, I have the stats wrong. He threw 43 last year, and then he threw 152 in 2023 in that season split between New York and Texas. But he hasn't like been Max Scherzer since 2022 when he was pretty dominant with the Mets. And I don't know, like, can you count on him now at this point?
Well, I mean, like I've kind of said, as we've compared him and Verlander all offseason, Verlander last year started to have more issues beyond, of course, he had the elbow surgery very late in his career and came back from that and was amazing. Scherzer, he's basically had every possible injury that's not an elbow injury, which you can say that's a good thing or a bad thing when he's 41. But yeah, since 2022, when it really started to get a little bit more inconsistent, I mean, you just pull up the trend, the injured list log. You got oblique, you got shoulder, you got back surgery, you got another shoulder injury. He finished the year with a hamstring strain. Like, all these things kind of add up when you are about to turn 41 during this season. And we said, like, I find myself a little bit more bullish on Verlander. You find yourself a little bit more bullish on Scherzer, from what I can tell. They end up with nearly identical contracts. Of course, Boras can take that dub, and we'll give it to him. But you also lump in Charlie Morton and Alex Cobb here, who also got 1 year, $15 million. And I'm just fascinated to watch these four pitchers who all come with, you could make the strong argument for, you could say, hey, Alex Cobb was an all-star 2 years ago before he threw 2 innings or whatever it was in 2024. For Charlie Morton, you could say this guy is the only guy that hasn't been injured, right? Okay, great. Like, he's going to at least show up and pitch. And then you have 2 Hall of Famers in Verlander and Scherzer. The last thing I'll say about those two is, I think at the start of the offseason, we were wondering, what would they be willing to take? Not from a financial side, but like, what situation would these legends be, I don't know about settling for, but, for a while, it's like, well, clearly they're only going to go to one of the best teams, But now that the finances weren't as much of an issue, presumably many, many, many teams could have afforded 1 year, $15 million. We know that. But Max Scherzer and Justin Verlander weren't just going to go anywhere. And I do feel like the Giants and Blue Jays, of course, there are big differences, but they're in similar situations of like, all right, like you've spent a lot of money, like you can squint and be like, they could be good, but a lot is still going to have to go right. And now these pitchers could be big parts of that, or it just, they're going to be old and, you know, Father Time will win and they won't be relevant this season. But I think they're both in very similar competitive situations, I guess. And from that standpoint, it makes the parallels between them all the more interesting going into 2025.
Ben Nicholson-Smith reporting that Max Scherzer is feeling discomfort in his back on May 19th. And that's the thing, right? It's like,
let's hope it's May 19th and not March 19th, right? I mean, can we at least like get into the season? Because both of these guys haven't even been able to start the season healthy recently. So that is what I'm hoping for. But whatever, when you're getting to that age, there's only so many pitchers that have succeeded at staying healthy as a starter for full seasons. But now let's just talk about the fit with the Blue Jays.
Well, so this is the thing. Okay, so the Blue Jays payroll, sneaky high, everybody. $250 million, which I guess is slightly more in Canadian dollars. Well, because the tariffs is what that means.
Keep dropping that buzzword. I think more people will listen if you.
I'm trying to say it enough so that I comprehend the incredibly complicated concept, Jordan Shusterman. No, they're spending money. The Blue Jays, if they do fail with this group, it will not be from a lack of investment. Okay. And I think that while that is commendable, it is certainly different than every other team in baseball, where it's like, if you want to criticize if the Reds don't make the playoffs this year, it's because they didn't spend enough. That's not going to be the case with the Jays necessarily. Like, they're running the payroll up there. It will be a case of spending the money poorly.
Well, that and whatever you want to blame on where the rest of their roster is at, the depth, the complete lack of young pitching, right? I mean, part of the reason why they end up having to bring in a Max Scherzer is because there's just no pitchers under the age of 27 on this team. And the ones that were promising, like Alek Manoah and then their prospect Ricky Tiedemann, had surgery. So they're not relevant. So now you have a rotation with Gausman, Barrios, Bassett, Scherzer, and then Bowden Francis, who was obviously a fun story last year, and maybe he can carry over that second half momentum, but he's already 29, right? It's not like he's a hotshot rookie. So you can, like I said, the same thing with the Giants. You can look at it and be like, well, this could go pretty well. And there's also, especially on offense, still reason to be a little bit skeptical.
Here are the teams with higher payrolls. Okay. Dodgers, infinite money glitch. Mets, Yankees, New York City, a lot of money. Phillies, the owner who is like, I will die penniless like Andrew Carnegie. Give my money to charity. And then the Blue Jays. Okay. Dodgers, Mets, Yankees, Phillies, Blue Jays. So like, if the Blue Jays go down in a blaze of glory, like, salute to you.
And then remember, they're trying to spend even more. Like we know they still could add, right? I mean, there's still
Bregman and Pete
they could use. Yeah, Bregman, they're at least reportedly in on them to some degree. But also, you have to remember that, like, because they're spending all that money, it's very easy to just prop up Toronto as like the Blue Jays are in. Like, that's an obvious negotiating play as well. But yeah, the Blue Jays are, again, bottom of that lineup is still not in a position where I'm feeling super enthusiastic, but there are still I am impressed with the degree to which the Jays have managed to upgrade this offseason, regardless of the massive questions that still face their organization, namely Vladimir Guerrero Jr. Anything else on these two pitchers before we take a break, Jake Mintz?
No.
All right. Let us take a quick break. And when we return, we're going to talk some prospects. A lot of prospect rankings coming out recently. So we're going to talk about some of our favorites going into the season. We'll be right back on Baseball Barbacast.
And welcome back to Baseball Barbacast. Why don't you heat up the kettle? Toss a little oolong in the mug. Light the fire. And cozy up. Because it's time for Jordan's Prospect Hut. Hut, via Merriam-Webster, is defined as an often small and temporary dwelling of simple construction, a simple shelter from the elements. In this case, the elements are not knowing about prospects, and Jordan is the hut.
What a nightmare. What a nightmare. Please, I'm just trying to, the shelter is yes, the knowledge of left-handers in low A. Jake, January is really, especially when the hot stove slows down, the end of January into February is really when these players get the most attention. Every bunch of outlets, whether it's MLB Pipeline, of course, is the official MLB league, but you have Baseball Prospectus and Baseball America and Keith Law and Kylie McDaniel, and soon we'll have Fangraphs, Eric Longenhagen. His list hasn't come out yet, but there's so many prospect outlets now, and a lot of them come out with their lists around the same time in late January and February. And so we're going to keep this pretty broad, but we, wish we had more time to talk about prospects here on this show during the season, but now is a good time to kind of take a step back and take a look at some of the players that maybe could be impacting the season this year, or should kind of file away to know for years to come. So I'm going to keep this pretty open-ended. There's just a couple either groups of players or specific prospects that I definitely want to talk about, but I'll kick it to you first, since I know you're kind of diving into this a little bit. I mean, I've been doing this every day for the last 2 months, basically, is following this. I know for you have a little bit more of a fresh perspective in that you haven't been knee deep in it. You're parachuting in and looking at these lists for the first time. Or relatively. So where do you want to start here?
Well, I want to start with something of a mission statement. I think that if you're listening to this podcast, you're already a sicko, and like, part of why we love thinking about prospectum is because it paints a complete picture of a player's trajectory once they get to the major leagues. So seeing them have success at the biggest level is obviously the most relevant and the most impactful and the most notable. But to understand the uniqueness of, say, Mookie Betts, right? Of even what Mookie Betts is now, understanding that he was a 4th round pick that was playing only second base and no one thought would really hit for impact power, and now he's going to be in the Hall of Fame, right? That gives you this complete idea of who the players are. And so for you, Jordan, as someone who is knee deep in this all the time, you then get this full understanding of these players when they do become more famous. And I think that that's really nice for me to be able to lean on. Here are the players that I am compelled by. Okay.
Please go ahead. Mm-hmm. Sure.
First of all, I think we should talk about Roki Sasaki. So Roki Sasaki is on some lists. He is not on other lists. Every list he is on has him at number 1. I don't like to think of Roki Sasaki as a prospect, even though he is one technically. This is not unique to him. Yamamoto was on a number of lists last year as a player who had not appeared in a major league game.
Silly.
Right. Okay, so is Tomoyuki Sagano, who's 35, a prospect after signing a 1-year deal with the Orioles? That line is always complicated. The idea, right, like Jose Abreu won Rookie of the Year as a 27-year-old who had been playing pro ball in Cuba for some time. If Tomoyuki Sagano comes out and wins Rookie of the Year as a 35-year-old, he can do that. That's allowed, right? However, he's not a prospect. Right. And so it creates this bizarre classification. For my purposes, if I was smart enough and informed enough to make a prospect list, Roki Sasaki would not be on it. He falls into a slightly different category for me because he is not going to play minor league baseball. He is not in a farm system. He will be on the Dodgers opening day roster. And so to call Roki Sasaki the best prospect in baseball feels not misleading, but doesn't paint the correct picture of what we're trying to convey through these lists.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. I mean, the way I say it is I think calling him a prospect feels a little bit more genuine compared to a Yamamoto, because I do think the 2 years, the age is relevant because Sasaki's only 23. But 23 is still older than almost every other prospect in the top 20, right? And so he's basically the same age as Chase Dolander, which is kind of fun. Like, that's another top pitching prospect that, like, you can kind of compare and appreciate kind of where they're at. Not to mention he's obviously close to the same age as Paul Skeens, almost the same age as like Matt Shaw. So it's not inconceivable. And I think that you still have prospects that are 23, 24, 25, but either way, I agree with you. So let's focus on the ones who we imagine will be either in the start of the year in the minor leagues or could be in the big leagues this year and people should know about or be thinking about at this point?
I think Roman Anthony is fascinating. He is number 2 on most of these notable lists that have Sasaki at 1 and at number 1 on the ones that don't. And as far as top prospect in baseball goes, Roman Anthony, despite being on the Red Sox, is not as famous as your average number 1 prospect in baseball. He has not risen to like Yoan Moncada or Jurickson Profar or Paul Skeens, right? Even, Dylan Cruz. Like, he is not at that level. And my questions for you are, why do you think that's the case? What kind of player is he? Right? And why is he number 1 effectively on all these lists?
So Roman Anthony is a center field prospect for the Red Sox who is going to turn 21 early in this season. And he just kind of checks all the he's just really good at a lot of things and has basically hit all the way up. He was very, very famous in high school and then was not awesome his summer before his senior year. And that is when a lot of the top high school players are being evaluated. And so even though he was very famous, teams were not as excited about him by the time draft came around. The Red Sox were still every bit as excited about him. And he got I think $2 or $3 million to sign out of high school. And then he's just hit. And the fact that he's proven he can be a capable center fielder is really what has vaulted him into, because when we talk about the guys, it's who can stay up the middle, right? That's a lot of it. And so Roman Anthony putting up his line as a average right fielder is maybe not the slam dunk number 1 prospect in baseball, but the fact that he's been doing it as a center fielder is kind of why. And again, how do you rise a prospect list? You perform well at levels at age, younger than what most of the people at your level are, whether that's AA or AAA. And Roman Anthony has managed to do that. But I want to lump him in here is with Christian Campbell and Marcelo Meyer, just because this is part of the discussion around the Red Sox this right now is there is this quote unquote big 3 of Roman Anthony, who is famous since high school and immediately just started hitting when he got to pro ball. Christian Campbell is he probably deserves a much longer conversation on his own, but he's a much more surprising breakout as someone who was a lower round pick, was not a superstar in college at Georgia Tech, made a swing change, and then had one of the great minor league seasons we've seen in some time. Marcelo Meyer, more along the Roman Anthony bucket of famous high schooler, has been awesome since he's been in pro ball. But they have these 3 guys that are approaching the big leagues, and it seems like there is some amount of discord between the front office and the ownership. Whereas you have Craig Breslow, who believes these players will be good for the Red Sox in 2025. And so I don't want to do anything that is going to block them, whether that's an Alex Bregman, whether that's an outfielder, whether that's whatever. And we're going to find out, because clearly Breslow's conviction in these players means we are going to see at least 2 of them probably very early on in this season. And that is why you need to know who they are, because when we're projecting out there, any team, no matter how high they are on any prospect list, never at any point when we are projecting how a team is going to be, do we put too much stock in what a rookie is supposed to be. It doesn't happen because it's irresponsible. Some of them show up and change their franchise like Paul Skeens. Some of them, like Jackson Holliday last year, were a complete non-factor, if not downright bad, right? That doesn't mean he's doomed to suck forever, but if you were counting on Jackson Holliday to be a huge part of the Orioles' success in 2024, that obviously did not happen. Maybe Roman Anthony, where he ends up on that spectrum, we're going to find out. But the fact that multiple of those guys are going to be given that opportunity, from what we can tell, is very compelling.
A good reminder that prospectdom is not dependable. The last outfielder to be ranked number 1 overall by MLB.com, MLB Pipeline, if you take Sasaki out of it and you say Anthony's a number 1, the last outfielder to be ranked 1st overall, top prospect in baseball was?
Going into the season?
Yeah.
So going into the season, no, tell me.
Andrew Benintendi in 2017. And so, who has been a helpful contributor, but certainly not a franchise-altering force. It's just a good reminder that this stuff is hard, right? And I'm sure is a sobering fact for Red Sox fans who are trying to get excited about Roman Anthony. Let me fly through a couple more names that you can educate me and our listeners on. A couple of Tigers. Jackson Jobe, whose rank is usually in the top 10, number 1 pitching prospect in baseball, not named Roki Sasaki, who debuted with the Detroit Tigers at the end of last season. I'm fascinated by him because of how pitching has changed. Now, back in the day, if a guy threw 97 or 98, like he was a big deal. And he went high in the draft and everyone knew their name, right? Nowadays, everyone throws cheddar cheese. So it's like, what are you doing with your gas, right? How are you using it? What do your other pitches look like? Can you spot it? Is the angle on the pitch good? Are you athletic enough to keep your velocity as you age and as you work through a season? Job is, and this fact comes courtesy of friend of the show, Kylie McDaniel. Job is one of just 2 pitchers in the last 8 years to be drafted in the top 5 at a high school. Okay. That's remarkable because if you go back and look at how many high school arms were drafted that high in baseball history, it's a ton. Teams have recognized now that it's not the best bet, that you can get a similar type of player later on in the draft and the risk is not worth it at that high pick. But for Job, it has gone pretty well. And he is now projected to be an impactful member of the 2025 Detroit Tigers. What makes him different?
And it's also relevant to our first topic, right? Like, I think without Flaherty, there was a very clear path to Job being in the opening day rotation, whereas now I think it's still very plausible, but there's a little bit more question about whether, if you assume that Skubal, Flaherty, Reese Olson, who they very much believe in as a starter, and then Alex Cobb, who they just gave a lot of money, that's 4. Injuries could change all these things. But then it's like Casey Mize, right? Cater Montero. We'll see if they have some of the Brant Herter. Do they kind of view him still as a starter? And then Job, they still have Matt Manning still hanging around there, Ty Madden. But Job, what makes Job different is, he spins the ball about as well as any amateur pitcher we've seen in a long time. Like, his combination of fastball and slider has been so exceptional. And even though he hasn't thrown that many minor league innings, some due to injury, some due to just workload management, he has everything that you have in terms of the combination of now stuff and projectability, because he's so athletic and because he's just has the build, has just the aptitude to improve his pitches in ways that, again, what checks all the boxes of what you would want to see in a high school pitcher, and just the explosiveness and the athleticism for that kind of pitcher is reflected in his stuff and has been reflected generally in his strikeout numbers in the minor leagues. And, the strike throwing will have to improve. He's going to have to prove he can throw more than 91 innings last year was by far a career high. So they'll probably still slow play. Like, I don't see him going out there and throwing 160 innings this year, but he's going to be pitching a lot for the Tigers in some form this season. And so how that fits into their competitive cycle is also interesting. But clearly they trusted him in some pretty big spots, in unique spots out of the bullpen last year. And I think they're probably ready to let him cook if he can earn that spot out of camp.
I remember he threw against the Astros in the wild card round. It was like an enormous spot. And that level of trust certainly does have an impact. Let me ask you about one more player, and then I'll kind of open it up to what you're compelled by. Sebastian Walcott, who is in the top 20 of most of these lists, ranked number 2 overall by Keith Law at The Athletic in all of baseball, certainly higher than what most people have. Walcott is a shortstop prospect from the Rangers. He is from the Bahamas. I would say of all the guys on this list, like, he is the one that I am both exhilarated and horrified by at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, what he combines is like, going into last year, he had only played at the complex level. He was 18 years old, and it was like, okay, this all looks really good, but there's a lot of players that, he looked really good and was hitting the ball really hard and it was playing shortstop, and like, he was checking a lot of boxes for sure, but you got to do it then beyond the complex. You got to do it in high A and double A. And the fact that he reached double A and still doesn't turn 19 until March, that's when you start combining performance with age, with tools, with the guys from the Bahamas and how much baseball has he even really played compared to the kid from Florida who's been playing every single day since he was 2. Like, that's the combination of projectability and upside is tantalizing. And why would I rank him number 2? No, but when I talk to people who put these lists together, I'm like, man, I'd still have Walcott a little bit higher, because if he's going to be starting this season at AA with the kinds of physical abilities that he has, and he's going to be 19 in AA, like that's what you look for. When you talk about phenoms, it's the guys that are at these levels as teenagers. And so while, yes, okay, you could say, oh, could his power be that much? He only had 11 home runs. That's when you start looking at the exit velocity stuff, and you look at the launch angle and everything, and you got to look forward and say, if he's already done all of this and where he's going to be, it's hard. There's not that many guys that you can say that about, and that's why he is that exciting.
Well, you look at the exit velocities, but for him specifically, like you look at him, he's enormous. Right. He's 6'4" and he plays shortstop. Yeah. Like it's wild. Okay, so that's Job, that's Anthony, that's Walcott. Let's pick two other dudes who you're interested in, and then we'll take a break.
One is one player, and then the other is just a duo that I'm lumping together. Again, we could do this all day. The one guy that I just think is underrated, and I think is also an interesting character in this season, is Braves catching prospect Drake Baldwin. This is someone that I've been very interested in since he was an amateur at Missouri State. I felt like he was very undervalued, but oftentimes when you look at those players, you say like, oh, they're undervalued. When a team picks him, it's like, awesome. Like if that guy becomes a big leaguer, that's a win. It's not necessarily viewing him as like a future impact player. But when you look at what Drake Baldwin has done in the minor leagues, when you look at his underlying stuff in AAA last year with truly elite hard hit rates and plate discipline and everything, and then you look at the fact that the Braves were like, Travis d'Arnaud, thanks for the memories. We're happy to move on from you. Obviously, they still have a lot committed to Sean Murphy at the catching position. But then you combine the fact that they did sign Jurickson Profar, because before that move, I was like, there might be at bats here for Drake Baldwin in the outfield. He has the athleticism to kind of get some run there. I'm really curious how many plate appearances he gets in the big leagues this year, because what he did in AAA suggests that he is either ready or very close to being ready to hit at the major league level. And for a Braves team that their offense, of course, on paper looks amazing, and certainly was not that for big chunks of last year. And for a farm system that is very, very, very light on position players, Baldwin, I think, is underrated. And I'm excited to see how much he gets to play this year for that team.
And the other thing about Drake Baldwin that is worth bringing up, I mean, we have not had an everyday black catcher since Charles Johnson in the late 90s, early 2000s. Bo Naylor, Canadian. Chucky Robinson debuted with the Reds in 2022. Bruce Maxwell spent some time in the big leagues, but we haven't had an everyday guy.
Harry Ford is another, right? Harry Ford is another minors catching prospect. We've seen more prospects that have come, but no, it's true. We just have not had black catchers, and there's a lot that goes into that. And there's been some very smart stuff written about that I encourage people to Google. But yeah, that would also be a deal. And now again, the path to him being an everyday guy with the Braves is hard. Maybe he's trade bait. That's another thing that I think is really compelling about him in terms of what
it's not even his, but it's not even his path to everyday. Like he could and should be an everyday quality catcher in the major leagues at some point in his career. Who are the last players that are interesting to you?
The last two is Travis Sikora and Harlan Susana. Basically two enormous right-handed pitchers with the Washington Nationals who are basically the same age. But Susana was invited to big league camp and Sikora not quite. This is the profile that normally you're kind of terrified of, because when you're throwing this hard, this young, we actually saw Travis Sikora throw in high school a couple years ago, his draft year. Harlan Susana got almost $2 million from the Padres. Enormous right-hander out of the Dominican Republic, was traded to the Nats in the Juan Soto deal. These kinds of players now are the ones that you're kind of running away from, because it's like, whoa, if you're throwing this hard, this young, like, we got to slow this down. I'd rather take the guy throwing 92 who's projectable. It was not looking great there for a little bit in terms of the strike throwing and just like, are these guys going to hold up? And obviously there's still huge questions about the durability. But there's very few pitchers, starting pitching prospects in the minors that throw as hard as these two do. And they're the same age and they're in the same system. And I'm really curious to see how both of them progress this year in a farm system that has been bad at development historically, but now might be turning a corner in that area. And I mean, Susana especially, like, We already saw him in big league camp last year in some games, and maybe one of them ends up a reliever. But those two together, I think, I love when there are prospects that are kind of joint at the hip in systems. And these two, as the contrast of the big kid from Texas, the big kid from the Dominican, same age, both run 100 as starters with questionable control. Like, these are fun ones to watch. I don't know if we'll see them in the big leagues this year. I doubt it. But they are pitchers that you could see a lot higher on these lists if they stay healthy and dominate in AA this year.
That's Jordan's prospect hut. If you want to get more involved and dive deeper into the world of prospectum, send us an email, baseballbarbacast@gmail.com, and my friend Jordan will probably respond to you because this is what he spends his free time doing. I like riding my bike and cooking. Jordan likes building spreadsheets about prospects. And that's not to say one's better than the other, because he certainly has less nicks on his fingers with his hobby. Let's take a quick break, and when we get back, we will break open the mailbag and do a very stupid draft. And welcome back to the end of Baseball Barbacast. Jake Mintz, Jordan Shusterman. What's that knock at the door? Is that the mailman? I guess that's not really what mailmen do. It's time for the mailbag.
Depends if they need you to sign, it depends on what's really being delivered. But we are opening up the inbox, baseballbarbacast@gmail.com. You've been sending some lovely emails, and we are going to read some of them. Where would you like to begin, Jake?
I would like to begin with an email that raises a fascinating question and made me think deeply about who I am as a person and a baseball watcher. This is from Evan. Hello, Jake and Jordan. I was listening to an episode recently where both of you talked somewhat negatively about the MLB All-Star Game, saying the perfect time to die during the season would be right before it, so you, quote, wouldn't have to watch it. Maybe that was
I don't remember which one of us said that.
I definitely said that.
It's probably you.
Hold
on. To clarify, could we clarify that was because we were having the discussion of the best time to die during the season? I like that you had just said that randomly, just as an aside, like a shot at the All-Star Game for no reason. That was the context of that conversation. Anyway, continue.
I consider the event to be one of my top 3 can't-miss events on the baseball calendar. I love watching what should be the best players in the world play with and against one another, and I feel like it translates well on TV. I was surprised to hear you guys might not share the same enthusiasm, but I might be missing the feeling of people who are closer to the game. What does this say about me? Am I not enough of a baseball nerd? Should I get more amped about the Rule 5 draft? Don't. I would love more of an explanation. Thank you, Evan. Here's the deal, Evan. And this applies to everything. If you like something and it doesn't harm other people, that's cool. That's it. If you like the All-Star Game, great. If you like streaming Laotian badminton, that's awesome too, right? Don't let other people yuck your yums, especially us. Now let's talk about the All-Star Game. You go first, Jordan.
Okay. I think it's a couple things.
Let's separate. Can we separate the All-Star Game from All-Star Week?
Well, but it's sort of related to my first point.
Okay.
We are very fortunate to have gotten to cover All-Star Week in general. But it's also one of the busiest weeks of the year for us. And it also, for us, generally has started on Friday, right? And to be clear, none of this is complaining whatsoever. However, all of our favorite things, draft, futures game, home run derby, it's not that you should like those more than the All-Star Game. It's that by the time we get to the All-Star Game, we're kind of ready to go home. And by the way, the players feel the same way. Okay. So I'm not taking away the mystique of it, right? But I also think that the All-Star Game is the event that I do think I would enjoy more on television.
Yeah.
I think that the game, the fun part about being at a cool baseball game is the energy and the atmosphere and the stakes. Yeah. And while I do still think that the MLB All-Star Game is way better than the other sports, it doesn't feel like when you're there, I don't feel like I'm appreciating the matchups from the press box in the same way that of course, you feel that in the postseason when you feel every pitch is a big deal. yes, we understand that, All-Star pitcher X is facing All-Star hitter Y. Like, it is cool to see them on the same field. But you kind of have that feeling for the whole week, just seeing them over the course of the day, all interact with each other. The actual game itself, I don't think when I'm in the stadium, I enjoy it as much as I probably would on TV when I get to see the pitchers and what they're doing to the hitters in the same way, where you're getting the mic'd up stuff, where like that's like one of the only times where I'm like, yes, mic everybody up, like let's do it. And so I think that's something where I do feel like I'm probably missing out a little bit on television. And I feel like when I've gone back and watched some things on the All-Star game after the fact, I'm like, oh yeah, like I didn't even notice that. Or like, that's not something that felt like a big deal during the game. So that's my personal experience. Of course, we're so lucky that we get to be there every year and we hope we get to keep going. But that's my I think what is the root of our less excitement around it.
It's just worse to me than the other things going on in that same place over the course of the week. I'm less interested in it than the other things. Except for the red carpet. I just see, like, the home run derby is my favorite night of the year. It is my favorite Major League Baseball thing. It is number one for me, except for Game 7 of a World Series. I love the derby because it is the only night of the year that exists solely to screw around. And maybe that is part of the issue I have with the All-Star game is I want more screwing around a little bit. Now, the flip side of that is if you want more screwing around, you end up with the super crappy All-Star games that the other sports have where it feels like a total sham. I understand that. I don't know. Maybe Adam Wainwright ruined it for me when he goosed Jeter that down the pipe fastball. Maybe it's because the All-Star game used to be more significant before interleague play and when you couldn't watch the other leagues players before TV, right? Before TV, the All-Star game must have been unbelievable because if you lived in, an American League city, let's say you lived in Philadelphia, okay? After the A's left. And you wanted to see Mickey Mantle. You had to watch the All-Star game, right? Care about the All-Star game because that was your chance to see the other league's players.
Yeah, no, of course. Historically, I think that's totally fair. But I think even for us, to me, it's so much about our investment and our energy spent on the other events. If there was only an All-Star game, if there was no derby and no draft and no futures game, and we all showed up and that was the only thing, I think we would probably feel a lot better or more excited about it. But once you get to Tuesday night after working basically nonstop for 4 days, it feels like the finale and we just kind of let it happen and then we move on.
Maybe it's because Elias Diaz won the MVP award 2 years ago.
No, but see, I love that. That was one of my favorite All-Star moments because it kind of broke the convention of it. But the point is Evan, keep loving the All-Star.
What you like.
This should not change whatsoever. And I would also say keep enjoying it from home. If you're going to spend money, I would probably spend it on the derby.
Go to the derby.
go to the derby. Anyway,
next email is from Ethan. Dear Jake and Jordan, recently heard your discussion about Seth Smith in Central Park. For those of you who don't know, this is our stupid idea that instead of a famous baseball player going undercover like Kyrie with Uncle Drew, we send anonymous outfielder Seth Smith to Central Park to hit a bunch of softball bombs. Then he takes off his face makeup and he's like, it's me. And everyone's like, who are you? And he's like, it's me, Seth Smith. And people are like, okay, whatever. Ethan says, I think you forgot a key point. Seth Smith could go play baseball in Central Park without a disguise. That's kind of the joke, Ethan. Despite having a pretty successful career, he was anonymous and looks like a regular guy. I also found the whole thing funny because he keeps to himself more than any athlete I've ever heard of. Maybe even more than Corey Seager. And he links a Brandon McCarthy tweet from Game 4 of the 2012 ALDS in which Seth Smith asks if going viral on Twitter was a good thing. That is a very good point. Thanks, Ethan. Ethan, great point. Jordan, I bring this email up because I'm currently watching a television program with my wife called The Day of the Jackal. I don't know if you've heard of this. It's on Peacock. Nope. It stars Eddie Redmayne as an assassin who wears a lot of different faces.
Him, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, and sure. I just think the idea of dressing anonymous baseball players up in elaborate disguises is just the fun. It makes me laugh every time I think about it.
Yeah, I mean, if we can, I think Seth Smith. But
who's
also,
the current
I would
version
also
of
like
that?
the idea.
It's me, Hunter Renfroe.
Yeah, it's
you know what would be great? You make Hunter Renfroe look like Mike Trout because he already looks like Mike Trout, but you make it more like Mike Trout.
And then everyone's like disappointed when it's not Mike Trout.
Yeah, it's like, oh my God, it's Mike Trout. No, it's me, Hunter Renfroe.
Seth Smith career WAR pop quiz.
12.7.
Oh, nice job. 11.6. Who's our next email?
Next and last email is from Michael. Michael says, hi, Jake and Jordan. I want to talk about the loss of the Juice Box, a.k.a. Minute Maid Park, and a potential new opportunity with Daikin Park. So Daikin Park, the new name of the Houston Astros Stadium. Michael says, I work on ways to combat climate change and its impacts by advocating for ways to reduce emissions from homes and businesses. Thank you, Michael. Michael, we appreciate that. That means that we're all going to die in 2078 instead of 2079 because of people like you. I know that sounds cynical, but I actually do mean that.
It's a huge deal, man.
Thank you. You may be wondering, great, but so what? Well, Daikin makes heat pumps, electric equipment that does the job of an AC and a furnace, which are critical to the mission of reducing emissions. The park also kind of looks like a heat pump with the roof closed. That's what I've always said. With this new name and look, I think the Astros should lean in and start calling the park the heat pump, while also using energy lingo during the game. For example, they can mention the, quote, inverter of the heat pump whenever the team heats up or cools down in a game. This is so niche. I love this. Like, someone must have switched the inverter inside the heat pump because they're heating up. Genius, Michael. That's really great.
Robert Ford's going to say that. That's good.
Let's see if Valdez can flip the inverter inside the heat pump to cool down this Dodgers offense.
Ooh, that just rolls off the tongue, that line.
I'm sure there are other energy puns to be made, and many that would be preferable to the current advertising inside the park claiming it's powered by natural gas. Anyway, appreciate what you guys do. Look forward to the season. Incredible email.
I just love how, because of his personal experience, he gave us such a deeper interpretation of Daikin Park beyond just like, oh, they make air conditioning, which I think is what a lot of people have interpreted as like, no, folks. It's the heat pump.
It's the heat pump.
So like calling it the ice box or whatever. Anyway, Michael, who calls himself quite possibly the only Blue Jays fan in Albuquerque. This is why we love what we do. I mean, we got Blue Jays fans in Albuquerque emailing us about what we should call Daikin Park the heat pump. I mean, doesn't get better than this. I mean, life is good. Anyway, how would you like to respond to this email?
This made me think about how silly of a name Daikin Park is. So here's what we're going to do very briefly, Jordan. We're going to draft stadium names. We're each going to draft 4. Okay, here's the goal of this experiment. You're trying to draft 2 great names and 2 bad names. So you should be taking the parks that you think are the best names and the worst names. That can be anything to you. Whatever you think makes a good or a bad name, you go ahead and you can draft them in any order. You're older than me, so you get the first pick.
All right. With my first pick, I'm taking Coors Field. I think when we talk about what Daikin had going for it, we liked that it was a shorter name, and the fewer syllables that you have, the better. I know we have some, acronyms in here, which we could certainly pick, but Coors, the fact that Coors just kind of holds, it has such a personality. It's a brand we know. It's a word we like to say. It's something that we like to just throw out there as Coors. First pick.
Totally disagree, but that's okay.
I guess going to make all the same arguments for Busch. Are you going to take Busch, or you wouldn't take?
No, I'm going to take what I think is the worst named park in baseball, and I'm going to take Lone Depot Park in Miami, Florida. The lowercase L or on lone is a crime, and I hate it deeply. What a silly name for a park. I will take the Depot.
But see, you're granting them the nickname here in a way that
and it's a terrible nickname.
Okay, well, if we're going with worst names, this is easy. I'm going to take one of the ones that we now have unintentionally, and that's George M. Steinbrenner Field. I think the fact that you
go to the George,
but do we have to say M? Is that, I mean, it's clearly part of the official name, but I don't know if that's what it says on the outside. I know we've been there a couple times. Do you know if M is a part of it? Because I think that would impact it. But either way, too many syllables. That's always my number one thing where I'm just like, this is not what I want to see. We got to find ways to shorten it. You said the depot. Maybe one of us will take American Family Field, calling it AmFam. Like, there's versions to do it. This one, I guess you can call it the George, but I don't know if the Rays are going to like find a way to make this more more cool, fun, slick, easy to say than it is.
I love Wrigley Field very much because the idea, I mean, this is not the reason it's called Wrigley Field, right? Like at this point, it just gets to still be Wrigley Field. It feels like it's named after gum, and that's funny. The idea that a gum company could afford to pay for naming rights on a park is so good.
So to that note, my next pick is going to be Petco Park, because I think that's another brand that is funny. I am obviously a sucker for alliteration. And I think, I mean, I guess you have PNC Park, but I think it's the only other stadium we have alliteration for. So yeah, I think that's easy. I'll go Petco Park. Also just a brand that's like, who's going to hate Petco? I mean, that's, sometimes you have these insurance companies, beer companies, like it's Petco. That's pretty funny that they name the stadium. So I'm taking Petco. I got Petco and Coors are my two good ones.
Okay, I'm going to take another crap one. It's an easy one. Yeah. It's a layup, and that's Sutter Health Park, which is where the Sacramento A's will be playing this year. You headed to the Sutter Health. Look, I assume Sutter Health sells healthcare, right? Yeah. I'm not all in on the healthcare industry right now, so I'm not going to take them. There you
go. My last pick for crap name is also a new one. Even though I just said it's good to have it shorter, Rate Field is
the worst. Terrible.
Is just patently ridiculous. We had been laughing at Guaranteed Rate Field for the past few years. Rate Field, I mean, it's just because now there's not even a positive or a negative ascribed to it. Like, at least I knew that the rate was guaranteed before. That felt like a kind of a positive connotation. Now it could be a bad rate. I mean, it's just, which it's the White Sox. So like, why would I trust that the rate is going to be any good? So Rate Field is my, I'm going to take Rate Field, which is the shortest, and then George M. Steinbrenner, which is, I think, probably the most letters.
Okay.
So I'll take the fewest letters and the most letters.
I'm going to take Kauffman Stadium, which I love because it is like Steinbrenner Field in that it's just named after a dude, but it's a nice sounding name. So I take the K.
All right. I mean,
good draft.
There's not as much variety here. A lot of parks, a lot of fields, a lot of stadiums. Sorry, Rogers Center. Good draft, though. Let us know.
Thanks.
What are your favorite and least favorite names? Again, not brand related. Jake, we have one more topic before we say goodbye.
Okay.
There was a basketball trade.
I saw.
A big one. The biggest one ever.
I saw. Yeah.
For those of you who don't follow basketball, this was a big deal because the Mavericks traded Luka Dončić to the Los Angeles Lakers for Anthony Davis. Luka Dončić basically having one of the great starts of the career that the sport has ever seen. Anthony Davis, very accomplished, still very good, but he's 6 years older than Luka Dončić, and everybody loves Luka in Dallas. And now everybody in Dallas hates the Dallas Mavericks for trading Luka. Obviously, when you have a trade of this magnitude, everyone's like, whoa, well, what is this in baseball terms? We're just going to spend a couple minutes throwing out some possibilities. There's nothing like it. Not just because there's no parallel because anything happens. It's because in basketball, if you got the one good player, you can go to the finals, which literally just happened last year with this very player who we are talking about. So while you could say, oh, he's like Bobby Witt Jr., oh, he's like Gunnar Henderson, he's like these guys, guess what? Those guys cannot do it by themselves. So there's really no actual comparison for this in baseball. However, because this is beautiful podcast fodder, we are going to try. Jake, I know you're not as much of a hoops head as I am relatively, but does something come to mind? Because I'll just throw out a couple nominations, but I'll let you start.
The first thing that comes to mind for me is Mookie Betts. In terms of a player that's still young with an outrageous list of accomplishments, projected to be a future Hall of Famer who can change the trajectory of your franchise getting dealt, Mookie is the obvious one. Now, what's notable about that is no one remotely close to Anthony Davis's quality went back in the deal. So it's almost like if Mookie Betts had been traded for like Matt Chapman at the time. You know,
well, right. So
like
there's
George
a few different ways we can do it.
Springer went the other way.
Right, George, who was much better at the time. That's the challenge. Is normally right. So you could say, okay, Juan Soto, but when Juan Soto was traded for the first time, the Nationals were terrible, and they traded him for a bunch of prospects. That is the difference here. So to me, it would be like, okay, if they traded Juan Soto in 2022, but the Nationals were like in the wild card race when they did it, and they traded him to the Padres for Manny Machado for some reason. That would be closer to it. And again, you also have to factor in that like nobody saw any of this coming. That's the other problem. So then it makes me think like, okay, it's a player who is transcendent offensively, right? Juan Soto, beloved by a fan base and has been there for a long time. That's the other thing is that what Lucas already has like 7 years of like all NBA first team or whatever. Whereas like Bobby Witt and Gunnar Henderson, yes, they're amazing and they could be that. It's 2 or 3 seasons and they haven't been anywhere close to a finals or a championship. This was another comp I came up with. Vlad Jr., if the Blue Jays were in the World Series last year and they traded him in November for Corey Seager, would be maybe, I guess, the trade. Corey Seager, I think, is the best analog for Anthony Davis. Same age, injury prone, clearly still elite, but like, are you really counting on this? That's why I really like the Corey Seager, Anthony Davis parallel. Because people comparing Anthony Davis like, oh, it's like if you traded Bobby Witt for Mike Trout, that's too complimentary. I know Anthony Davis is, I guess, better right now than Mike Trout probably is right now relative to their sports. But that's like, no, Anthony Davis was never on path to be one of the greatest players of all time. The last comp that I would make here is Acuna. I think Acuna has a lot of Luka parallels. If you had traded Acuna where it's like the Braves, if the Braves had traded Acuna for Corey Seager, someone suggested this on Twitter, you know, you'd be like, the Braves would be like, well, we need a shortstop. And the Braves fans would be like, who cares? Like it's Acuna. What do you mean? Like we love him. He's 26. He was MVP. He could be the best player in baseball. Oh, he has some question marks, but like what? That's nuts. He's the reason we are Braves fans. We love Acuna so much. So that's the other one that I like. But obviously, you know, it's impossible because these are different sports, and that should make you appreciate how ridiculous this basketball trade was in a basketball context. I think that's it. I think we're done. This was a fun podcast, though. We covered a lot of ground.
Thanks, man.
Thank you.
Thanks
to Colin Brennan filling in, producing this podcast. Thank you, Jake Mintz, for co-hosting with me. Thank you to everyone who emailed us, baseballbarbacast@gmail.com. Any final words?
Yeah, dude. This is my last podcast from my desk for a while. I'm not headed back to Asia on another honeymoon. However, on Wednesday, I will be getting in my 2011 Toyota Prius and driving to Florida for spring training. I know I'm going a little early. I got a family thing I'm doing the weekend before, but like in 2 days, this is great, man. Usually for me, you know, as someone with depression, this period of the year is the worst for me because I just don't know what to do with my hands.
Yeah.
Leaving for spring training on February 5th is really a huge boost. I'm going to do this every year. Just pretend like it starts early and earlier so I can be a little bit happier.
Well, you will be down there. I do not head down to Arizona until the 12th, but spring training is indeed right around the corner and we are very excited. So thank you all for listening. We appreciate it. We'll talk to you all later this week. Goodbye.